Welcome to this week's OK at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, and my colleague, Russell Berger, both attorneys at Offit Kurman. And today we are talking about different ways that businesses structure employing their employees. Um, it can sometimes be done through having a management uh, entity that's over top of your main entity that holds the employees, staffing companies. There's a lot of different ways other than just employing employees directly that some businesses utilize. What are some things that you've seen, Russell, with your clients and that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, so as a starting point, we often see kind of the multi-entity or the multi-operation business, and oftentimes it's under one umbrella where you've got three or four locations that do the same thing, whatever your business is, um, and employees sometimes flow from one to the other. They're used interchangeably, and oftentimes from a risk mitigation standpoint, the advice is to silo the risk. So create a different LLC for each entity or for each operation, and keep that separate. Um, and that's generally really good advice. The challenge we often see is that, like I said, when employees move from one entity to the other, or one operational site to the other, they become an employee of each entity. And we don't need to go into great detail here, but there's a concept in the law called joint employer status or joint employment, where multiple entities could be employing one person at the same time. So one of the ways in that kind of structure that we go about addressing that is we put all the employees into one entity. Usually it's a management entity. There might be other things besides employees that go into that entity that then gets shared across the multiple operational entities, and usually for a fee. And there's a cost. So that way, the each operational unit is paying a fee for labor and or other resources to the management company. And that tends to be an efficient way to structure the employment status, because when you have employees that can be working on multiple different entities, I mean, number one, it's just confusing to try to keep that all straight. If you have four different entities, you're getting four different workers' comp policies, four different EPLIs, four different everything. It's a lot more efficient to structure it in one way. And as I was saying, you're going to have that risk anyway, and it's much harder to silo employment risk than it is, some of the operational risk. So by putting all that into one management entity, you actually are more effective at mitigating some of that risk across your entities.
Yeah, and it can really simplify things in those situations that you're describing. And to the employment risk and siloing that risk, I think whenever anyone's thinking about where they're housing their employees, and I see this a lot with staffing companies, for instance. So when they're doing something similar, kind of what you're describing, only they're using an outside vendor instead of their own kind of company they're setting up for this process. That folks feel somewhat insulated by having this other vendor involved. And it's really something to be thoughtful about because, again, employment risk is really hard to offload. It's very regulated, and it's something that it's really challenging to get around if you're controlling the employees and you're overseeing the employees. That when there's a staffing agency involved or other entities involved that are employing those employees, there's places to point fingers and different entities to get involved, especially when you're using an outside vendor, depending on what the contract is and how you offload that risk. But when you're the face to the employees and the employees are on your site and they're really working for you, you really need to be mindful of the fact that you're still going to have a lot of that exposure and risk as the company that is overseeing their day-to-day operations and those things. Even if another entity or a staffing agency or something's paying their paycheck, you want to be keeping an eye on what they're doing as well, just because you're not completely insulated yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big takeaways from our episode today is that employment risk is just hard to shake. Whether you're trying to spread it across different entities, it'll follow you around. If you're trying to offload it to a third party that manages your employment, it's still from the employee's perspective, which is how all these laws are written. The employer is responsible. The employer is responsible for ensuring there's no discrimination in the workplace. The employer is responsible for paying properly, and so on down the list. And the employee is always going to be able to go after the employer. And employer is a very broadly defined term in a lot of the laws. So, while you can offload that risk, you can do different things. Um, you still have to be conscious of making sure that the employees get what they're entitled to under the law, because when the employee gets hurt, you're the first person they're going to come after, whether you have a third party claim against somebody else or not. The real you're always going to hold that exposure as it pertains to the employee.
Yeah, and it's one of those areas of the law too where there can sometimes be some personal liability even despite your entity structure. So there's some nuance to that would take us a long time to dig through, and way too long for an okay at work episode. But that's just another reason to be mindful of these things. And also, yes, if you are using an outside, third party vendor, really pay attention to your indemnity clauses and those types of things. So just something to be mindful of and keep track of as we always discuss on here. So, well, thank you, Russell, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sarah.